Hi, Misha here, and I'm actually taking a break in between packing for the Eclipse Day because I had to do this video. It's going to be a little bit about the French Dassault Mirage 4A to be exact, their nuclear strategic bomber, but mostly it's out of sincere and deep gratitude to user Abrit for sending this to me. This is the second time he sent me an aircraft. And the first time was a Corgi. And this one's interesting for a few reasons, and something I'd actually been considering. So, in addition to just being grateful that someone thought of me and sent me something that I could use, and it was a little bit of a surprise. I just knew it was going to be a Mirage. It's actually a brand I have been kind of curious about, and it's not readily available here in North America. So this is a 1/72 scale diecast, and it's from Dassault Aviation PremiumX. And well, it's an officially licensed thing, so to get it essentially from the real factory is pretty cool that it's a licensed model product. And for the most part, I like it. But I do have a few criticisms, not of Abrit, of course, but of the model. But overall, in America, beggars can't be choosers when it comes to French Dassault aircraft because of their licensing. Luckily, Hobbymaster has done some Mirage 2000s. Panzerkampf has as well. We have some Mirage 3s coming from Hobbymaster finally. A few other things, but really, the only company that did Mirage 3s and F1s before was Falcon, and the problem there was they were not licensed. But Dassault Aviation, PremiumX, does the Mirage 4, of course, the Mirage 3. They do the Mystery planes. They do the Mirage F1C. Kind of interesting, and yeah, but being over there, not here, and not really sure about the quality. I was interested, but never took the leap. So I guess he took it for me. I'm not sure if I should be grateful or resentful if I end up liking it and buying more, though. But I will say the box, I don't keep my boxes, but this one's tempting to keep because it's actually quite nice. It's a, double-sided, very thick cardboard, kind of like a Corgi box, only nicer feel. The lid fits very tight too. It's nice, thick. Has quite a bit of history on it. And then inside, there's kind of a faux velvet tray. It's plastic with kind of like G.I. Joe hair flocking on here, but it's got compartments for the landing gear, the doors, space for the stand. And I believe these do also come with decals where you can put different squadrons. So yeah, presentation starts off very nice. And I will say too, this made it over the pond to me undamaged. Although I did manage to break something very early on into getting it, which is one of my criticisms and one part that I do think is pretty about this. But we'll dive into that. I've got to touch on some of the history about this because it is a unique aircraft in French service as well. But we'll do more with it in a bigger Mirage video when I have time. Like I said, I'm in the middle of packing and doing laundry right now. But yeah, I was raised to say thank you when people do things for you, and would have felt horrible not at least doing something before leaving for a few days. So thank you, Abrit, and let's dive in. The Mirage 4 story begins in the 1950s. France wanted to be a nuclear power and independent, although for a time they would cooperate with NATO on various levels. And they wanted to have their own independent nuclear delivery force, and they realized that they really didn't have a bomber capable of doing so. I mean, what they had were outdated and kind of repurposed from Korean War, even World War II era technology. After the Suez Crisis in 1956, they got serious about developing a new bomber as their next generation of freefall nuclear bombs were coming into service. And the Guy Mollet government first really issued specifications. They didn't want aerial refueling, needed to have good range, needed to be able to carry at least a 3-ton bomb, a lot of other stuff. And the French government started working with Dassault on real serious specifications in 1957 and would submit a proposal based on the Mirage 3, but really based on a night fighting version of the Mirage 3 that never went into production, that had 2 engines, and also based on the unproduced Mirage 2 Interceptor. The same basic delta wing technology, but they weren't the only ones to submit designs. Nord Aviation and Sud Aviation also adapted existing designs to try to fulfill this strategic bomber role. And it was a pretty radical ask at the time, because not only did it need to be able to carry a payload reasonably far distance, France wanted it supersonic. In 1957, that was a big ask. You know, like the B-58 Hustler, which never really went into service full scale in the U.S., was one of the few supersonic nuclear bombers available at the time. So yeah. But to no one's shock, in April of 1957, Dassault was declared the winner. They helped make the specifications, and so they put their design into practice, starting to build the first prototype known as the Mirage 401. The initial prototype was about twice the overall weight size, well, not size, but weight of the Mirage 3. It had about twice the overall wing area, had 2 engines, it held 3 times as much fuel as the Mirage 3. So even though it looked very similar, it was just doubled up, even had a 2-seat cockpit. And in 1958, a new government under Charles de Gaulle came in, and he was very much a fan, a proponent of French nuclear independence, and, well, they needed a bomber because they didn't have a submarine, they didn't have ICBMs at that time, they didn't exist really, so they really needed something to deliver nuclear weapons. Now, they didn't expect to ever, like, obliterate the USSR or the Warsaw Pact. They just wanted to be enough of a threat, you know, be able to have the threat of taking out half a dozen, maybe a dozen cities, so that France themselves would not be attacked. They had concerns about NATO abandoning them or not making them a priority. Not saying right or wrong, this is what they thought. And, you know, with their experience of Germany in World War II, you can kind of see where they were coming from. But it would take a while, over 18 months, for the first prototype to be completed, because even though it was based on Mirage 3 technology, a lot of new manufacturing techniques were employed. You know, not the old riveting and stuff. They were new ways of cutting steel, attaching steel. They even used some titanium, not much, but some, in the first prototype. And so it just took them a while to kind of iron out the bugs. And of course, it would have to have quite a powerful radar setup and sensors and you know, all that good stuff. So, yeah, technology. But by the end of 1958, the first prototype was ready, was undergoing some ground testings, final checks. And then, June 1959, a French Air Force general would fly the first prototype. And originally they were hoping to hit about Mach 1.8. Well, during testing in 1960, they were able to get the prototype up past Mach 2.1, nearly 2.15. So in some ways it was exceeding expectations. And by the end of that year, they'd flown over 150 test flights of the first prototype. And so it was well underway and under development. But it didn't quite look like this version here of the model. This is the Mirage 4A. What's the difference? Early on, even before the first prototype took to the skies, there were plans to make a larger version with more fuel, capable of longer range without any kind of aerial refueling. This was known as the Mirage 4B. But it never happened. Right after the first test flight, it was canceled in July of 1959. Instead, a bit of a interim measure was selected, the Mirage 4A. It was slightly larger, with a little bit more fuel, but it had uprated engines, which were thirstier, so it kind of offset that. Its big thing was the Mirage 4A would rely on aerial refueling. And with that pattern selected, 3 4A prototypes were ordered, and these would be built between 1961 and 1963, and each one would be closer and closer to a production model. And even before the first of those flew, in April of 1960, while the original 01 prototype was undergoing testing, the French government placed an order for 50 Mirage 4As with Dassault. The first 4A prototype, also known as Mirage 4-02 because it was the second overall prototype, flew in October of 1961. And then in 62, this prototype would undergo the very first testing, simulation, bombing run missions. Just again, working things out. The second A prototype, third overall, would be the first built with aerial refueling. And we'll start to see targeting systems and some of the weapon systems come around. And then finally in 63, the fourth prototype, the third 4A overall, was pretty much full-featured, although some of the technology would get tweaked a little bit. And that would lead to December 1963, when the first full, true production model would take to the skies for its first test flight. And from there, full-rate production was underway. The very first aircraft were delivered to the French Air Force in February of 1964, and the first squadron stood up and became, at least initially, operationally ready October 1st, 1964, and would be France's first and only nuclear line of defense and attack for a very long time. In fact, up until 1971, it was the only at all, and through about 76, it was still kind of bearing the load for some time. So that's why these are actually very important to the country and a source of national pride. And it was quite an interesting jet. And this one seems to be in more of a 1966 or so paint scheme, because in the 70s they got more of a camo scheme. So let's talk about the specs and a few features of this rather colorful, creative French bird. The full production Mirage 4A measured 77 feet long, including the nose probe, and had a wingspan of 39 feet. And it ended up weighing 3 times that of your average Mirage 3 fighter. It's because it was designed for high altitude, high speed attack, dropping a free fall bomb. Initially the AN-11, later the AN-22, which is 60 kiloton bomb. And for this, it needed speed. And because of that, it would end up with really the thinnest wing in Europe at the time, and really among the thinnest in the entire world. And what's really impressive, that was done for supersonic flight. What's really impressive, it also housed some fuel tankage in the wings. They were even able to squeeze a little bit of fuel tankage in the vertical tail. So they squeezed in fuel wherever they could. And on top of that, 2 of the 4 underwing hardpoints were plumbed for tanks and were often used. The 2 other outboard hardpoints were only really ever used for chaff flare dispensers, ECM pods, that kind of thing. This never did carry air-to-air missiles, even for defense, and while in theory it could carry standard traditional bombs, about 16,000 pounds in total, it never did, at least outside of experimentation. Nope, the center line, which was a little bit of a semi-recessed hardpoint, just carried quite a big, fat, heavy nuke, at least in the beginning. Later, a few other options would appear. The 4 never had a cannon, never had missiles. So its defense, if the speed didn't get you, or where the defense pods under the wings, and that was it. Had a max altitude of about 66,000 feet, and had a crew of 2, pilot in the front, radar operator who was also in charge of the nuclear weapon in the back seat. They each had their own canopy, and there was actually quite a powerful radar sensor suite in a round dish right behind the canopy on the fuselage, which is quite interesting. It was powered by 2 Smegma engines, and about it, just it was meant to do one thing, and that was its purpose, and that was kind of the thing. Now, production was a little slow. In fact, according to some sources, the final ones were not delivered until 1968. That's because France was insistent that everything here be domestically designed and produced. They would only give way on a couple of pieces of technology, but for the most part, everything in this plane, vast majority, was French through and through. But they were perfectly happy and even wanted subcontractors, so it wasn't just Dassault that would benefit. Dassault Aviation and Breguet were both declared as primary subcontractors. Now, Dassault would make the front part of the fuselage, a lot of the avionics, and a lot of the nuclear systems. Sud would make the rear part of the fuselage and the very thin wing. And Breguet would make mostly the tail and a few other bits and bobs. And of course, a lot of the components were other subcontractors too. The pilots were French. So yeah, as I said, we had a total of 4 prototypes. In April of 1960, the first production order for 50 was placed. And right after the first squadron became operational, in November of 1964, an additional order for 12 more was placed. And these would be an updated pattern to kind of reflect changing doctrine. Like I said, this was a high-attack, high-speed aircraft, but with new SAM technology and other defense systems and whatnot, low-speed terrain-following nuclear attack was becoming more and more the thing. So these last Mirage 4s would have updated avionics, nav systems, what have you. They would also have upgraded engines, making them more of a low-altitude attack aircraft, or strategic bomber, I should say. And I should also mention that it wasn't just the last 12 that got this. The initial 50 would eventually get the updates too to make the fleet unified. And this is an interesting concept. Yeah, it's a big aircraft when you compare it to fighters, and maybe expensive when you compare it to fighters, but compared to strategic bombers, especially supersonic ones, this was a cheap, small, relatively easy to maintain, low maintenance aircraft alternative. The trade-off was the range. Okay, we had aerial refueling, which helped, but on its own tankage, even with drop tanks, if the balloon ever went up, it would basically just be able to go one way. I mean, to be fair, it was going to be a one-way trip anyway. But in theory, if it wanted to go to Russia or Ukraine, which were its primary targets, in return, it would have to meet up with the tanker. Eventually, they would get some KC-135s from the USA. They'd get 14 of those and use them in service. And there's another plan, too, in kind of a buddy system. But that's a good point to jump in to talk about the squad organization of these, because it was, again, rather unique and rather French. These operated in squads of 4, and that was further broken down into pairs of 2. And typically in this, one would carry a nuclear weapon, and the other would act as a wingman, and sometimes also as a buddy refueler if needs be. especially if the KC-135s weren't around yet. Interesting system. Now, each squad was kind of broken up. We had a total of 9 squads in service. So 9 times 4, 36 planes were kept in service at any time. The other aircraft were undergoing routine maintenance or just simply being cycled out to save air hours, because these were kept on alert. We'll get to that in just a minute. But yeah, they were doing a lot of flight hours. I mean, that's how nuclear aircraft were at the time. The squads were grouped in sets of 3, so a total of 12 aircraft, and these were classed in wings. And there would be 3 wings. So 3 wings of 12, again, getting to that same total. And what's interesting, though, is they weren't all grouped together or even at 3 air bases. What France would do to try to keep their service up and running in case of a nuclear attack, so they could not be knocked out at once, essentially they were split up all across the country. So they were pretty well dispersed, even amongst the wings. I don't know, I found that kind of interesting. And really, this was the only production model, and France was the only user of this. And after the final aircraft were delivered in '68 and the previous models were updated, the grand total production, 50 plus 12 plus 4 prototypes, were 66. So not a huge number, but it played a disproportionately important role in France's strategic nuclear air force. But first, let's talk about this model from Dassault Aviation PremiumX. So, things I like about it. Okay, the packaging is really nice, and it is a true die-cast model. This thing is heavy. The wing, the fuselage is metal. I think the tail is too. It is honest-to-God die-cast. And while the canopy doesn't open, that's okay with me. Corgis don't usually either. It does have gear up or down, which is nice. And the gear doors fit really well, really tight. Maybe a little too much so. It's kind of hard to get them in and out, but better too tight than too loose in a lot of instances. And as I mentioned, they do come with decals, so you can kind of customize the way you want. And really, notwithstanding the cost of shipping, the actual price on the store isn't horrible. I took a quick look before doing the video, and it seems like, adjusting for conversion rate and all that, they're around $60 to $70 new. So kind of in line, even a little cheaper than Corgi, definitely cheaper than Hobby Master. So the fact that you don't get removable ordnance, it comes with the fuel tanks and the center line already installed, and you don't get removable pilot figures, that's fine. But my one huge complaint is this goddamn stand. Something that die-cast model makers do that drives me crazy is they'll make a heavy model and then give it a light plastic stand. Corgi is one of the better ones, and Hobby Master has learned a little bit about this, but this is the lightest stand you could think of. And if it were solid, that'd be one thing, but it's actually 3 pieces fitted together. The 2 verticals actually kind of slot together tongue and groove, so that's not very secure. And then they fit on the base with 4 tiny pegs that are smaller than like a G.I. Joe foot peg, and then that fits under the aircraft with 4 tiny pegs. And I was trying to figure out, because they only fit one way in the plane. So I had the plane laying upside down in the box, and I was fitting the stand to figure out which way it was, so I wouldn't drop the plane. And I was trying to, rotate the stand around and, try it this way. It's like USB. Every way you try it won't work. And then my phone rang. So I let my hand go, and the stand fell not far and onto carpet. No big deal. Except one of those tiny little pegs already snapped off. Yeah, just falling from this table to carpet and not even like getting knocked. It's just like it was standing on the plane and it kind of went whoop and rolled over. I've never once had a Hobby Master or Corgi stand get even remotely damaged from that. The aircraft are a different story, but this is just a flimsy stand, and those really tiny pegs are not great, especially considering it's slotted together and itself wants to wiggle and wobble. So I just glued the crap out of the bottom. We'll see how well it works, but I was going to glue it anyway because there's no way. I think the idea is they want the stand to be configurable, but between that and the secure stand, which is meant to keep your plane safe, I'll take safe. So I may look for an alternative stand or something because it makes me super nervous. And if it breaks the plane, I will be very, very sad. Luckily, the plane does feel solid, but yeah, that's my major complaint. It would have been nice to have extra ordnance because there are a few different variations of this aircraft, different loadings. It would have been kind of neat to configure the undercarriage just like they let us configure the numbers, but hey, oh well. And again, getting the gear on off, getting the door on off is a little problematic. Putting a tiny little hole like Hobbymaster does, I like that better than Corgi's style of giving a little lip. It looks so much more obvious when you look at it, but the Hobbymaster little hole style with that tiny little wire key, that's a good compromise because you don't want to have to go scratching at it and try to pry it out. So while I am happy that they fit tight, I'm also happy that this is officially licensed. Now, that's not to say it's 100% correct. No model ever is, but it is nice to go, this is the one that Dassault said, hey, this is our aircraft. And as I said, this is a point of national pride for the French. So, yeah. Now, of course, as far as I know, this is the only Mirage 4 made. Like I said, Falcon made the Mirage F1. They made the Mirage 3. Hobbymaster's done several Mirage 2000s. Panzer Comp has 2. Hogan's done them in smaller scales. But, yeah, the Mirage 4 seems to have been overlooked. And to be fair, when I was talking with a Brit on comments on a video a few weeks ago, I didn't know much about the Mirage 4. You know, it does just seem like a double-engined, double-seat Mirage 3. So you start kind of digging in. But in a lot of ways, it's more unique than that. But I also get it too. Dassault is really strict on their licensing, whereas certain other aircraft makers are not. But what do you think? Maybe I should order more. Dassault does do a couple of interesting aircraft. The Mystery kind of interests me. They do one of those. Their F1C might be interesting. We'll see. So I guess at the end of the day, even though the stand kind of makes me super nervous, it's not enough to turn me off from maybe thinking about getting one or two more of these and seeing how it goes. With that though, let's go back to the history and service and some of the interesting variants that ended up coming in the series. In 1964, just a week after they had gone fully operational, the first squad took to the skies because there was a nuclear alert. Obviously, it didn't go further than that, but they were already being pressed into service. And then in July of 1966, the one and only time a Mirage 4 dropped a live nuclear weapon in a test came. It was one of the new AN-22s in a similar, if not exactly this color scheme. And around this time too is when France finally completely left the NATO Strategic Command structure, nuclear deterrence and unification, and went their own way. And this would lead to the Mirage 4 being flown a lot and frequently. Basically, like I said, there were 36 ready to go at any time. 12 were always in the air. The next 12 were on 4-minute standby alert, and the last 12 were on 45-minute standby alert. So they would fly a lot of hours, nearly 250,000 over the first decade, and have over 40,000 aerial refueling events, be it from other Mirage 4s or the KC-135 tanker. Yeah, they were heavily hit upon for work, which would wear some out. There would be a few accidents. It always happens. Some of these were stationed in pretty out-of-the-way rural areas, even kind of rough airfields. For that, they even had the ability to have up to 12 rockets attached for a rocket-assisted takeoff, ROTO. One thing I didn't mention, I said, in the prototype stage, it was up to Mach 2.1. The full production model, especially with the uprated engines, were able to hit Mach 2.2. The limit wasn't the engines. They could go faster. It was the heat buildup on the aircraft. You'd start to warp things and break things. So kind of like with the MiG-25, the limiting factor was more the plane. Of course, in that case, the engines would break themselves apart. This would break the plane apart. So that was the max safe warp speed, Mach speed. Quite impressively, it was able to sustain Mach 2 for 30 minutes. This is quite an achievement for an aircraft. And it also set several speed records in 1960 and other events for a couple of years. So it was in some ways very much on the cutting edge of its technology. However, by the 70s, that was changing. Charles de Gaulle credited the existence of the Mirage 4 with his decision to remove France from NATO in that way. It was such a key, critical part. But soon, Soviet anti-air defenses were able to keep up with this. Even when they switched to the low-altitude profile, it just wasn't enough. So finally, in 1971, France would start making ICBMs active. Also, submarines would become nuclear armed. And ultimately, this would lead in 1976 to one of the three wings of Mirage 4s being disbanded for the nuclear deterrence role, the strategic bomber role. The two others would keep flying. But because of this and because of changes, in 72, this actually freed up a dozen of these to be refit into the Mirage 4R reconnaissance variant. And not a huge change. They would just modify the centerline pylon so they could carry a CT-52 pod, old wet film, 3-4 cameras, reconnaissance. And these would first be deployed over Chad in 1974 and be used for quite a long while in places like Iraq, Kosovo, Serbia, even Afghanistan. So the 4R was reasonably successful for what it was, and fit the profile well. Certainly better than trying to use the Mirage 3 in this role. But trying to keep it at least relevant for the strategic bomber role, in 79 they started a program to develop the ASMP standoff nuclear missile. And this would end up being a 150 to 300 kiloton yield missile with a range of about 250 miles, so certainly better than a freefall bomb, because the old AN-22 was useless at this point. And of course they'd have to modify the aircraft to work with the new missile. So the first prototype rework would fly in 1982, and then a contract to update 18 of the Mirage 4s was issued in 84, and it was now designated as the Mirage 4P, P for penetration. And these would start to see service in May of 86 in the nuclear force. And basically it was just a much needed update. They would modify the centerline pylon to work with the cruise missile. That required changing the radar, the avionics, updating the cockpit a bit. We would never get missiles, but we would get updated in more electronic-based jammer pods and decoy dispensers for the outboard stations, and just kind of refreshing the airframes at that too. So it would take a little time to get those done. And of course, that's 30 we're talking about, 18 and 12 being updated. There were others. Some were just worn out by this point. Some were lost over time. It happens. But that was kind of its fate here. Luckily, for all of us, the 4P never had to fire its weapon in anger. And it was finally stood down in July of 1996, being replaced by the Mirage 2000N. However, the reconnaissance version would carry on for a bit longer. In fact, 5 of the lower air hour Ps were transferred over to the reconnaissance wing, becoming effectively Mirage 4Rs, because again, not a huge difference, just, different connections and everything. In fact, each could have always carried a nuke or a reconnaissance pod. That made me nervous. So I'm going to take it off the stand. See what I mean? They're just 4 little pegs. Which is a shame, because I kind of like everything else about this. Holding it in my hand, it is very, very weighty. Okay, the vertical tail, because it is so thin, is plastic, and the shock cones area of the engines are plastic, where the mice were, but the metal is back here. Wings are metal. Here's the underbarrel belly while I've got it off. Still metal back at the engines. Right there. Here's our big ol' radome there. I see why Dassault says not to pick it up by the tail, because it is the plastic, so. Is it? It feels plastic up here, but then down here it almost feels metal. Don't know. Oh well. Canopy cockpit. Nice probe. Anywho, so yeah, 5 will be transferred to the reconnaissance wing and operate in Kosovo in '99 and in their initial time in the War on Terror in the 21st century. And finally would be retired in 2005. Most of them were just kind of reaching the end of their hours and without a major overhaul program. And they never did use digital reconnaissance pods. They were always the old school analog wet photography style. Now the idea was to replace them with the Mirage 2000Ns or Ds carrying a new generation recce pod. That got super delayed, and so the not all that much newer Mirage F1CR had to kind of step in and fill the gap. It did its job, I'm just saying, yeah. It didn't have quite the range and endurance of this guy. It'd be kind of neat if they did do a later style reconnaissance version, or maybe one of the P standoff versions. So with that, by 2005, it was finally out of service, but that's a very respectable time frame. I mean, over 40 years, and they did see a lot of use, especially in the reconnaissance role, especially considering how few were actually made, and quite a few are in museums to this day. Now, I said France was the only operator, and that's 100% true, but that wasn't originally the plan. In fact, Dassault hoped to export this, or at least variants of this. So let's end with that. This stand really wouldn't be a bad idea if it was made of metal, or didn't use those little pegs and something else, like maybe a kind of a slot system. Anyway, we could have had an Australian version. In the early 60s, they absolutely had to replace their aging Canberra bombers. And the Mirage 4 was seriously considered. But in the end, they selected the F111C. And hard to say that was a bad call, considering that Australia had quite the affinity and put that aardvark to well use. In 1965, the UK canceled the TSR-2 bomber. And that left them with a huge gap, British politics. And so that year, Dassault France, along with BAC, who had been cooperating with British companies, offered a modified Mirage 4 known as the Mirage 4S, which had upgraded engines, British avionics stuff put in, a little bit of range, all that stuff. And the Brits tried it out, but decided it still didn't have enough range, didn't have enough bomb load, couldn't operate well enough from unprepared airfields, which is strange. Either way, they rejected it. Instead, they went with the F-111K. In the end, it really didn't matter because they canceled that too. So even if they'd selected the Mirage 4S, it would have just got Dassault's hopes up and still been canceled in a couple of years anywho. Unfortunately, these events did kind of damage the aircraft's reputation with foreign users. For example, India. It was kind of hoped to target them, but since they failed with Britain, this kind of took them out of the running. And they also hoped to sell maybe some to Israel, but French-Israeli relations really started to break apart in 67, 68, so that never happened. And after that, they just kind of gave up. Production was wrapping up. They were moving on to other aircraft. The F-1 was coming along, other things. So in the end, even though there were efforts, they amounted to nothing. So we just had the one small production run, even though it stayed in service for decades, and that was it. But of course, this would lead to other things. For example, its engines would be used in later Dassault aircraft, so that's kind of neat. And it really gave France a nuclear force that it would not have otherwise had. And it was budget friendly compared to maybe the alternative at any rate. So, I said I was going to do a brief video. I guess I lied. I got into it, the specs and things, but at least I did resist the urge to drag out other aircraft and really get into the analysis. And I really do have to go back and start packing. I may see what's in stock on the Dassault website too, when I get time. But no, again, sincerely thanks to Brett, and I'll put this on the shelf, and hopefully the stand is kind to me, and nothing bad will happen. I'll just have to be extra careful with it. With that, hope everyone has a good weekend and good eclipse day. This is Misha, and catch you very soon next time.